Trichronic asks if I can suggest any other mite providers. There's a lot. I get this question a lot, and the answer that I have is really most of the primary producers are effective. A lot of them are going to have their own unique product lines in a lot of cases, their own unique formulations of biocontrols. In some cases, they might have groups of biocontrols applied at once in one single sort of unit, or they might just have different numbers available at different prices. So for some people, it might make more sense to go to one or the other. Some of the, really large names that I'm totally comfortable mentioning are things like, Copper Biologicals is, for one thing, it's got a lot of history, and so it's also got a lot of innovation. So Copper Biologicals is one of them. Beneficial Insectary, which was recently acquired, I believe, by another biocontrol company. There are BioLine is another one. BioBest is another one. A lot of them have very similar names, so sometimes I don't like to mention because it can be a little bit confusing. And recently, like with a lot of things, there's been a lot of consolidation in the industry. A lot of cool innovation as well, but also, sadly, a lot of consolidation. And that can cause ripples in the sort of biocontrol ecosystem, essentially, from a business standpoint. And it'll be interesting to see what effects that has 3 years, 5 years, 10 years into the future. Good question. Do I have a recommended vendor for purchasing insects? Says Joyful Voice 777. Not really. In my opinion, generally speaking, if you're using one of these bigger names, you're probably going to get a superior quality product. You're probably going to get really good customer service. And in my experience, at least, all of them are vulnerable to supply issues. They're not immune from, freak accidents happening sometimes where the culture of mites that they have is, for some reason, not what they thought it was. That does sometimes happen. Recently, it was found that there was a lacewing species that was being sold by one of these biocontrol companies, and it was Chrysoprula carnea, the green lacewing. But in fact, I think the populations were bought. Some of them were bought as like a sample for some research, and the researchers found that there was actually a bunch of what are called cryptic species. So species that were not the same species that they thought they were, but they look identical to us. But when you sequence them at the genetic level, they're actually different enough to be a different species. And one of the ways that you can tell is that the adults actually have, the lacewing adults, they have a unique way of communicating with other adults, and that's through using vibrations. So they transmit those vibrations through the plant. And other insects sometimes do this as well, depending on the species. So they found that they have different vibrational calls, essentially, and that was how they were able to delineate, or there was a big similarity between these two. If I'm remembering correctly, that's how they found out. But anyways, yeah, they're usually going to have a lot. They're going to have a lot of benefits no matter who you use. So it's really a question of where you are, what makes most sense for you economically. If you're a larger scale grow, then you might have to, or might be asked to make a particular relationship, sort of a contractual relationship. If you're going to be buying X amount of biocontrols per year, then they might be able to give you something of a sale or some sort of a beneficial arrangement for using them in particular and not using other biocontrols. So that's potentially an opportunity for some people. But yeah, generally speaking, for most people who are only going to be buying a few bottles per year or something like that, a lot of them are pretty great, to be honest. I don't have one that I feel like is most superior versus the others. Also, there's a lot of movement, like I kind of alluded to earlier, between different companies because they're specialists, they're technical specialists that they might move from one company to another because those are the people who are going to want their skills, right? And they might be working for people who might be working on interesting things. So that's kind of one aspect of the dynamic. SoCal Vermiculture asks, if outdoors, do I recommend spraying the spraying the plants before releasing biocontrols? Yeah, I do. It's called a knockdown spray. That's usually really helpful, but it does depend on what you're trying to accomplish, what is your target, and also what you're applying. If you're applying something that's going to be negatively impactful to your biocontrols, then you want to wait the appropriate amount of time before releasing them. And since usually you order the biocontrols and they're shipped to you, and in my experience I was usually like a week between like order and reception, so you have to apply whatever you're going to apply at the right time and have the amount of time interval between when you last applied and when you applied the biocontrols, which, if you don't know, should be immediately. If you're applying predatory mites, predatory insects, parasitoid wasps, other kinds of predators, essentially, they need to be applied almost exactly when you get them. A lot of times you'll get them in the morning, but it depends on where you are and what's going on in the world. But if you do get them early in the morning, in a lot of cases you want to apply them basically in the morning when it's cooler, when you're not going to have a really hot environment with a bunch of light and that sort of a thing. Some predators and other biocontrols this is less important for. But yeah, if you apply a knockdown agent, then you're going to reduce the population significantly, and then biocontrols will come in and sort of mop up the remaining population. And they do it 24/7. So whereas a spray has to perhaps make contact with the target, and then it will have some sort of residual effect for a certain period of time, and then probably decays or otherwise becomes, not useful anymore, the biocontrols will be used 24/7, right? They're going to be constantly eating, they're going to be constantly searching for prey. And if you buy from a reputable dealer, you'll probably have higher quality products. So that's always very important to keep in mind. Oh, SoCal Vermiculture said spraying with water, not with another product. So that wasn't very useful for you. No, I would say not. I would say that's generally not super useful, but it depends on what you're aiming at. Like, for example, people like to mention that you could dislodge a bunch of aphids simply by spraying jets of water. That's true, but the added surface moisture might have some other contingent effects, right? Like I recently presented on the Future Cannabis Project 02 channel, botrytis loves high surface moisture, and it will definitely make use of an environment that's very wet. And some other fungi that cause bud rot and other sorts of diseases, they will also probably appreciate the extra moisture. So too might certain biocontrols that you might be using that might also be fungi or bacteria, but you have to weigh those in a cost-benefit analysis. But generally speaking, I don't feel like water is very appropriate in most cases. You might be able to hurt or reduce some populations, and if you're in a very austere environment, it's one of those tricks that you can use. It's a tool in the toolbox. So is, for that matter, culling. So if you have a small population of like a spider mite population or a thrips population, well, thrips are a little bit vagile. They will fly and they'll leave if they're disturbed too much, which is pretty easy to do. But if you have like spider mites, which are a little bit less responsive, if you notice a small population, you could just kill it. You could just remove the leaf or whatever. If you have a very small one that's only on one leaf, just trash it, just kill it, in a controlled way. Don't just throw it on the ground, but and stomp on it, which I've seen a lot. But, take all of the leaf and crush it, put it down the drain, wash your hands, do whatever you want to do. Then you save yourself a bunch of money. You didn't have to apply a biocontrol at all, for example. But you might realize that just because you saw spider mites and you killed them here doesn't mean there might be another population elsewhere, especially in a larger area where you can't necessarily see every single leaf. And if that's the case, I like to recommend that you cull, especially a not significant amount of population, and then just to be safe, apply either a spray that's for that target or a biocontrol that's for that target, just to make sure you're covered and protected. It's like we said, like we saw in the example earlier, it's usually worth the money and the investment of time. But to go back to Estonario's question about having Hypoaspis and mold mites in their humidifier, or rather just the mold mites, they do like the high humidity. In fact, a lot of people have come to me asking why they have these mites that are in their foliage, and these mold mites are also often used as feeders for biocontrol agents. So they can get out of the packets themselves, sometimes they establish on the leaves. They don't typically damage the plant. I have seen them damage especially seedlings, and they'll also go after like roots that have been rotted away and things like that. So they're exacerbating a problem that already occurred. They're not the cause of that problem, but a lot of people don't realize that in the moment, and they might think the mold mites are a real massive pest. Or they've never encountered them before, and they can look a little bit intimidating, especially in large numbers. But when the humidifier, when the humidity goes up, then mold mites sometimes move from just the soil into the foliage, and that can kind of cause concerns. But only in your mind. It's usually not going to be a big deal for the plant itself. It's usually not going to damage the plant or at all, or if it does, very, very, very mildly. They're not really plant pests, actually. But as far as going into your humidifier is concerned, I'm not sure about that. You could just try to clean it more often. It's sort of a offhand remark, I suppose, but it kind of depends a little bit, because you might want to see where the source is of those mold mites, if they're in the soil or whatever substrate you're using. In this case, soil, right? So, but for other people who might have other kinds of substrate, if you have free organic matter, a lot of it, and you have a lot of moisture, then the mold mites will reproduce quite a bit. And then you can get these large populations that maybe can be very adventurous in going and exploring the rest of your room. If you reduce the moisture in the substrate and you reduce some of the free organic matter, not get rid of it totally, but some of it, then you can curtail the population pretty quickly, and that might help you out with the humidifier issue. Will Ards asks, without the use of fungal spores such as, I assume they mean Botanigard, Woodable Powder 22 WP I should say, are there any beneficial bugs or products that you would recommend for dealing with root aphids? I don't want to compromise my biodiversity in order to treat root aphids in large indoor living soils, beds, or pots. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of examples for other things, because the problem is that most biocontrols are not hypogeal. They don't go into the ground. Like I said earlier, green lacewings, brown lacewings, they go after aphids and some other insects, but they don't really go into the soil at all. Rove beetles, I've never really seen that personally being a hard counter for rice root aphids, and again, they don't really burrow into the topsoil enough in most cases to really have a major effect. And maybe they'll feed on some of the ones that egress into the foliage, but aphids are born pregnant and they reproduce with basically clonal offspring, so it's kind of difficult for you to really expect the rove beetles to control that population, or lacewings for that matter, or other things like that. And I think that's the main reason why microbial pesticides are so effective, because they're not operating on the same sort of, resource or reproduction schedule as the insects are. Quick as they are, the Beauveria bassiana fungus is going to be, which is in Botanigard 22 WP, for those who are curious. And also you can use things like Eiseria flumosauracea. These fungi are insect pathogens. They are naturally in the soil. You can apply a larger proportion of them with a product, and you can kill a bunch of them. You could use other products like pyrethrin or azadirachtin, for example, and I imagine that the reason why you don't want to use something like that is because you're under the impression that that's going to harm or jeopardize the biodiversity that you're talking about. But I would ask you these questions. The first thing I would ask you is, what is the biodiversity in your soil? Do you actually know? How familiar are you with it, and how are you verifying the diversity in that soil? Not saying that you don't have a diverse soil. Most soils are diverse, and they're usually a lot more diverse and biased towards the plant, whether helpful or harmful, the closer you are to the rhizosphere, and then less so the further you get away from the rhizosphere, which is usually within a couple of centimeters of the rhizoplane, which is the root surface. So that's an important thing to consider, I think, because these products, if you know what is in your soil, then you can tell if that product is going to be a negative effect in some cases. But in a lot of cases, these products aren't going to kill all of the things or even most of the things. And even if they harm some microbes that are in your soil, it doesn't mean that they're going to kill the entire population of that microbe in that soil. And I think that's a really important concept to sort of understand, especially if we're talking about microbes that are endophytes or can be facultative endophytes, so they can live in and also around or on the roots themselves. So they might have refugia, because like in nature, of course, right, you know, the environment changes, it can become very inhospitable, and these microbes are either adapted to that environment or they're not adapted, or various pockets of the population will sort of develop and mature and mutate in ways that are going to be different than others. And you can't really track that in your soil. You can't really track that very comprehensively anyways. So I bring it up because it might be something that you aren't able to really tell for one thing, one way or the other, and that's the intellectually honest answer, in my opinion. But it's very important that you're not, I support not compromising on that biodiversity. I don't think that you're going to have, because like, for example, if you use something like pyrethrin, which is a very common insecticidal agent, it's a botanically derived compound. But that doesn't mean that it is going to be, totally without any flaw. That doesn't mean that it won't harm or might not negatively affect some things. Azadirachtin is the same way. Azadirachtin is just one compound in, for example, neem oil or something like that, which has many other compounds. And various ones that are associated with the neem tree are antimicrobial. But that doesn't mean anything, because which microbes are we talking about? Are we talking about fungi? Are we talking about bacteria? Or are we talking about Oomycota? Are we talking about protists? Which ones? We don't know. We don't know which ones are being talked about. So if you want to err on the side of caution, maybe don't use them at all. But it's possible that you're still going to have essentially the same effects that you're able to observe with your eyes, and not the ones that you're able to observe by sequencing the microbiome of your plant or your rhizosphere, and maybe it works out still. That's my intellectually honest answer. I don't think there's anything wrong with being cautious though, because the cautious seldom err. But it's a good question. Pablo Gabriel Horgy asks, what's your take on IPM sprays, like the Athena IPM series? I'm from Argentina, and we don't have IPM sprays, but soap and neem. I actually don't really like the phrase IPM spray. I think it's a little oversimple, to be honest, because it doesn't really tell me anything with great detail. And like you point out here, you have soap of some kind. I assume that might be a horticultural soap, and neem oil, I assume, or some sort of neem derivative product. And both of those are IPM sprays, right? And there are other ones out there too. There's nothing wrong with, so IPM is integrated pest management, so any kind of chemical agent or biopesticidal agent that you apply, those are both sprays, but they're very different from each other. So my take is that spray applications are totally fine. It's what you're applying that really matters. And it matters how much of it you're applying, and it matters at what rate you're applying. So your intensity and your rate of application. Like with the question from before with rice root aphids, they're very pernicious. Beauveria bassiana is my favorite way to counteract them. It's a little bit expensive, and it is a spray application, but one that you apply to the substrate as well as the foliage, potentially, depending on your circumstance. And I think that that's a highly effective application, and it's not bad for the environment necessarily. You don't have the other sort of negative impacts that you might have with a chemical application, which is why the question was asked so adroitly. You know, they don't want to affect the microbiome in their soil, and so they're going to be using something that is going to be kind of adding to the microbiome, but not really subtracting from it, since it's really just a parasite of insects. So it's really very dependent on what you're dealing with. I don't think it's really appropriate to apply over much. And then to define that, you know, like some of these chemical agents, they might be natural or they might derive from plants or microbes or something. But if you apply these things too much, you can run the risk of resistance. You have to manage your resistance. If you aren't doing that, and if enough people aren't doing that at once, then some of these products might not be available to us as an effective strategy. That might seem sort of, you know, preposterous, because plants have been using them for, you know, at lower levels for hundreds of millions of years. But resistance is something that is easy to develop, especially in insects and other microbes too. So for that matter, some of the organisms in the soil microbiome from before perhaps aren't even negatively effective at all, because it just doesn't interfere with your physiology. Oh, I'm glad that I nailed that pronunciation, Pablo. I appreciate it. You know, I do speak some Spanish. I have a working understanding of the Spanish language with many colorful terms to my lexicon. Pablo says that it's a shame that they're from no importation land Argentina. Yeah, it's very difficult, and that's why I make the comment about like austere locations. I've helped people of many stripes, people who are well-moneyed, people who are not well-moneyed, and a lot of people from different countries, for that matter, who don't have the same access to certain resources, or people just simply, or I should say organizations just simply don't service those locations. It's a real difficulty, and especially since a lot of these biocontrols, you know, they can be more expensive, which makes them prohibitively expensive in other countries, but also they might not be available for invasive species and biosecurity reasons, because the country might be cautious because they don't want it to upset their local environment. In some places they just don't care, but in a lot of places they do, and none are so fastidious as New Zealand and Hawaii in the United States of America. Those places are particularly fastidious about what goes in and out of their particular land. Native 910 says, I'm in North Carolina, I assume. I had some outdoor destroyed by what looks like termites. They ate the root from stem and continued up into the stalk. Is there anything you would recommend? So I posted about termites before in cannabis. I think it's one of the more underestimated or underappreciated pests that have been a little bit more recent in my experience. So I don't know how long they've been colonizing cannabis. There may be examples far into the past, maybe a decade or more, that it just went underreported or not reported at all. However, termites, if you're dealing with termites that affect your living plants, there's only a couple of termites that really do that. And unfortunately, like I posted before, these are maybe Formosan or Formosan termites. And Formosan termites they're really bad. The experts that deal with these kinds of termites, they have said things like, as soon as they establish in a location, it's nearly impossible to eradicate them. And in many locations where they have expanded to, this is essentially the case. And the main problem that they have is that, unlike other termites that only feed on dead wood, these feed on live wood. These feed on living plants and dead plants. Dead wood, I should say. So the only way to treat them is to attack the nest, but the nest might not be on your property. so that can be challenging to deal with. You might not be able to find where that nest is, and what people use for other kinds of termites are usually only for, like we said, dead wood or building materials. Those aren't really compounds that are conducive to our health if we apply them to our plants. And in some cases they might be completely illegal. In most cases this is probably the case. So I don't really have a whole lot of sort of good examples for treatment. I have thought about sort of doping a bait of some kind for like ants, for example, and maybe something similar could be done with termites, but it's one of the newer pests that doesn't really have a whole lot of counters at the moment. And I'm going to post probably in the edit for this video several of the videos and pictures that people have sent me from all over the world about termites that they've dealt with, and it is a growing problem in my opinion. And I see them in California, I've seen them in India, and I've seen them in a couple of other places that I can't remember off the top of my head. Trichronic says, don't apply anything at the end of flower. UVC lights are going to be a huge IPM alternative in the next few years. I would challenge that statement and say that they already are, actually. They are already a huge alternative to chemistries and even microbial biopesticides in a lot of places. It really does depend though. In a lot of cases you have to sort of make a cultivation setup that is going to allow you to use them as effectively as possible. The main problem with using UVC, at least in my opinion, is that UVC can be damaging to the plant as well. So you have to time them correctly, you have to time the application right, and you ideally are using it at the regular interval, or you're using it as a quick response to something that you've seen, something like mildew or botrytis or some other sort of pathogen like that. But I actually find that to be a really endearing category of pest management techniques, and I think that although the technology has been around for a while actually and has been employed in many kinds of crops already, I think that is becoming easier and more democratized, so I look forward to seeing that used more. Pablo asks, have you talked about Hypoaspis? I have on my YouTube channel Zenthanol. I've talked a lot about the predatory mites in general. Mainly I've talked about predatory mites in the family Phytopseidae, which are the most common predatory mites people deal with. So those are your Persimolis, your Swirsky, your Cucumeris, your Californicus, species like that. Hypoaspis is a species that is in the Laelapidae family, and it is a pretty nice mite to add. It can help deal with things like fungus gnats, for example. I do like to mix it in with other biocontrols in the soil as well. It can help with the disruption of, like, for example, western flower thrips, because they're quiescent form. They're sort of immobile form. They don't really have a pupa. I've called it a pupal form before, but in reality it really isn't a pupal form, and I'm incredibly persnickety, so I should be using the right terminology. So they're immobile form, they often fall into the soil, and they can be helpful for killing and then disrupting these larvae that were going to become adults and lay hundreds more eggs, but then did not. So every little pupa or every little thrips counts. Jordy Beans Jeans 1 asks, Matt, what is your favorite fruit to make homemade fruit wine? And that answer is probably going to be pomegranate from my parents' pomegranate tree when I was still quite a bit younger. When I was in high school age and early college years, I would make pomegranate wine. I would also say that my favorite fruit wine is probably blueberry wine, but I basically never encounter it, and I don't really drink anymore, so I haven't had really much of a reason to go out and do that. Oh, and I guess I had my opinion, I made a really good blackberry wine that I was pretty proud of, and my friends drank to great excess. I also made a pineapple concentrate wine one time, and I thought it was terrible. I thought it was gross, so bad. But my friend Travis, he loved it, and so he got to drink all of it, and I had no problem with that. So yeah, I think pomegranate is probably my favorite to work with, right next to blueberries and blackberries. Trichronic makes a great point that nematodes are really great for fungus gnats as well. In fact, they're my favorite control for fungus gnats. They're also kind of my favorite control. I think fungus gnats are basically the one thing I use nematodes the most on as well, so it's sort of related in that way. I don't really use nematodes for other root-based pests. I haven't really found them to be effective against rice root aphids. Some people have said that they are, but I haven't really encountered that from my own experience, and I'd like to see research that maybe kind of shows like maybe what I'm doing is wrong, what other people are doing is wrong, or I don't know what, but I don't think that rice root aphids or other aphids are particularly appropriate hosts for the nematodes. Usually they need larger hosts or hosts that can't react to their presence very easily, so it's a little bit up in the air I think for that. But in my experience, they're basically most essential for fungus gnat larval annihilation. King Koala 108 asks, any good solutions for dealing with root knot nematodes in cannabis? It's very difficult, to be honest. I don't have a lot of good solutions for the root knot nematode because, for those who aren't familiar, there's a few different species out there, for one thing, and I'm not really sure which species is being referenced here, but root knot nematodes, they get into the roots and they cause a bunch of galling, and they create these massive, large, like basically warts on the roots essentially, and by doing so they're able to feed on the plant material, and then they kind of just create this larger gall that kind of protects them as they develop and then produce more themselves. So it's kind of difficult because once they've established in your plant, it's kind of like game over, and at least for that plant potentially, as it slowly starts to become less and less productive, and basically the nematode population, which is often pretty large if you are dealing with them in the first place, it causes them to be choked essentially from nutrients. And again, unfortunately, a lot of the products that I'm familiar with that you would use against root knot nematodes are not something that I would use on cannabis. So that's kind of the main reason why I have some difficulty recommending anything for them during their infection. If you don't have any plants in the ground, there are a few other things you can do. I think solarization is something that people like to utilize for the nematodes, for the root knot nematodes, and also some other problematic nematodes in the soil, and similar kinds of sort of soil parasites. But solarization has its downsides, right? Because it basically nukes everything in the soil. Some things are going to survive, but not everything. And so it's a little bit difficult to really know what's going to be the outcome in that particular angle. OG Hippie says that I should spend some energy trying to confirm or positively confirm the difference between the unknown, unidentified soil mites that look like mold mites but are living on rove beetles and fungus gnats. This is a reference to a video that was shared with me. And to be honest, it's very difficult to do that sort of a thing. I think I already explained to this person in particular and some others that essentially mold mite is just a common term. There's all kinds of species out there. Some of them are not even documented. Others are, but the amount of taxonomists who know which ones they are and how to tell them differently from each other, is very, very, very small proportionally. And to that matter, we already have an extreme lack of specialists with regards to arthropods in general, but insects and mites in particular. There are so many insects and mites, and comparatively, there are so few specialists like entomologists and things like that. Also, it's important to note that it's totally speculation on the part of this comment whether or not these mites, for one thing, are unidentified to scientific literature, and for another, whether or not they are different even from the harmless mold mites that exist, because under certain conditions, like I explained earlier, these mites might be problematic for certain organisms. And in this particular video, where rove beetle is being attacked by presumably mites or mold mite licking mites, they might be attacking something that's weak. They might be attacking something that's already dying, that's moribund. They might be attacking something because they haven't eaten in a long time. They might be very much more hungry, and all of these things are going to affect the behavior. They affect the behavior of large animals, and they affect the behavior of small animals. So in reality, it's kind of a difficult ask, to be honest, based on all of that context. But I definitely have to support the enthusiasm for greater research. Grow More Flowers asks, what company or specific product for UVC light would you recommend? I don't really have one, although I will take this opportunity to mention that I've seen some lights out there that I think are maybe not up to snuff. I'm not sure that they are going to be helpful for anyone. So I would just caution that if you see a product that might be... You should always ask this question. Why are you talking to me? Why are you communicating to me? Why is this advertisement, this advertiser, why is this product producer, why are they advertising to me on Instagram? Why are they advertising a product that's new? Why is a new company talking about a new product that you can buy really quickly and easily? You know, oh, you can buy it, you can pre-order it. You can pre-order this really great, amazing product. And it makes all of these, you know, large claims about its capability, but there's basically no pedigree. The company might be very new, the products might be very slim and new. In that sort of case, I would be a lot more skeptical, and I would ask for more information, that kind of a thing, before you spend your money on such a product. And you also have to ask you have to ask whether this product is even going to be very useful in your setup. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to this, to be honest. I just mostly come across products that are not super useful, or they're products that are kind of they're part of a whole system and like a greenhouse. I'm mostly referring to things like in the Netherlands, they have a bunch of greenhouses that are set up with UV light systems that will move along like a train track essentially, or a conveyor belt, and they will dose the plants appropriately on a timed interval, and that seems to work really well for them. If you don't have a system that is going to be timed, or that gives the correct amount of dosage to the right amount of exposed area, then you might be not as efficient as you could be. Because for one thing, if you have just like a handheld implement, then the dosage is going to be totally different. If you're moving it across the plant, or if you're setting it up into place, and as the plant grows and the foliage grows, you're going to get different amounts of sort of light penetration through the canopy. If it's under the plant, if it's in the center of the plant, if it's coming out from the external area of the plant. All these things are important to consider, and I feel like I come across a lot of products that are in theory they would make a lot of sense, but in practice maybe less so. But it's a good question. Aussie Auto's official asks, sorry if this has been answered before. Do you have any comments on using JADAM wetting agent and JADAM sulfur as pesticides and fungicides? Not really, not anything super negative or even super positive, only to say that I know people who use JADAM to good effect, and I am definitely a supporter of low-tech products, low-tech techniques, essentially. Low techniques, however you want to put it. Basically techniques that make use of resources that are ample, that you can create yourself for sort of minimal cost, essentially. Basically the cost of labor, and maybe the cost of some refining materials, maybe a setup that makes your process more streamlined or something like that. Then I would say that that's very useful, and things like this, products like that, I think are really useful and really beneficial, whether you're using it for fermentation, for getting certain kinds of microbes, or getting certain kinds of nutrients to be accessible quickly and easily, and then applying them in that rapid way. I'm a fan of that kind of stuff. But to be honest, I personally don't utilize or get the opportunity to utilize a lot of JADAM type implementations, because I just happen to not work with a lot of people who are using JADAM themselves. So that's kind of been my experience with it, but I'm not against it or anything like that. Grow More Flowers mentions that products targeted to cannabis growers are often overpriced garbage. Yeah, there's a lot of products. Not only I was thinking in my examples here that I would mention the green tax, and how you obviously have the taxes from the government if you're growing in a legal framework, but you also just have the green tax of a product that is made to appeal to cannabis growers, and then hike up the price because the product is maybe not so useful, but people don't really realize that, and they're not going to be thinking about that. And it's very I feel like it's kind of cliche to say like things like do your due diligence, but it's true. You got to be vigilant, and people who follow me and have followed me for a long time will be able to tell that I take a lot of umbrage with people who are trying to sort of surreptitiously pull the wool over other people's eyes. At least from what I can tell, sometimes I've even been wrong. Like, this looks like it doesn't work, and then it comes out that it's actually quite effective. So that does happen too. But you don't really know, and sometimes there's not enough information to really make an assessment. And if you don't have that information, usually I feel like it's not really worth it, unless you're in a very desperate situation. But wouldn't you know it, that is exactly the kind of person that their product is meant to appeal to in a lot of cases, right? Grow More Flowers, you had asked what would you recommend for spray and what interval for thrips control. I would like to save all my cucumeris for the flower room. Okay, cool. That's a good point. I really like that strategy. And indeed, for those who don't know, this is actually a pretty common thing that I like to implement as well, because I don't like to apply in flower. So it's very common that people will like to apply biocontrols in flower so they can avoid using certain sprays. And I think this is most effective, like most biocontrols, by applying during flower, and that you're applying preventatively before you see a problem. Because every time you apply only reactively, it's going to take time for those mites to actually affect the problem, and that's assuming that you catch it early. If you don't, then you're looking at some level of yield cost, like we were talking about earlier. So what would I recommend for the spray? Well, if you're only in veg, a lot of people like to use sulfur. A lot of people like to use votable sulfur, and I find it is very effective. But you could also use plenty of other products out there. There are neem-derived products that are very useful. There are pyrethrin, for example, botanical insecticides that are like that are also highly effective in my experience against thrips as well. You could also use some horticultural oils potentially as well, but I don't like to use them personally because I think that they have a real nasty habit of being kind of unwieldy to use, and for people who've never used them before, they might over apply and burn their plants. I've certainly seen that happen a lot. So it's not that the product itself is necessarily bad, it's just that it can be a little bit more difficult of a product to use. And when you have access to products that are, well, cheaper and easier and more accessible, it's kind of like, why would I necessarily use the other stuff too? So although there are other options, I do want to give a more succinct answer so that I don't have to edit so much in the post-production. I'll never forget working with some pepper growers, and they were trying to use Beauveria, and they were wondering why their Beauveria product wasn't working. And I asked them for the spray report, right? And what were they applying? They were applying sulfur, and they were mixing it with the Beauveria bassiana. And they didn't know that the fungus is going to be killed by the sulfur. And they had done this for months. So much money wasted. So many peppers unnecessarily harmed. Simple mistake costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's why that was kind of, stories like that are the impetus for this particular subject. King Koala 108 asks, when applying IPM sprays, is there a minimum amount of wait time before applying a nutritional foliar spray? It depends on what you're applying, both the foliar spray and the product. I like to have like at least a day or two in between, but some operations don't really account for that, or they aren't able to account for that time. So, but generally speaking, I like to be cautious. I like to not push the envelope. In my experience, when people start to be very streamlined, they might think that they can get away with some of these tolerances or these wait times, and it ends up being very problematic and costly. So if it were me, generally, it depends on what's in both of those, but I would like to maybe have a day or so, or at the very least have other products that were applied, maybe that are less potent and perhaps will displace or otherwise sort of neutralize whatever was applied. I'm thinking of heavy hitters like sulfur, probably going to have a big effect with a foliar spray that you might apply afterwards, but there's plenty of other things that have a similar sort of interaction. And next session we're going to talk about a different topic. You'll be able to vote for that topic on my YouTube channel on the community tab. So if you're interested in that, please go to my YouTube channel Zenthanol and vote. I usually like to hold over the second place winner from the last session of voting and bring it in along with 2 other new topics to talk about. So if you're interested in a topic and you're very passionate about it, and you really want me to talk about it, and hopefully I've picked it, then vote for the ones that you like. And also in the comments of this video, as well as the comments of the community tab, let me know if you have ideas for other topics or just other general questions. I love to help out and answer those questions. So thanks a lot for your support, and I look forward to our mutual success. Have a good one, everyone.